Hello, nice of you to drop in. I've spotted something interesting. It appears that the Universal House of Justice may have done a U-turn by recognizing the separation of church and state as part of Baha'u'llah's world order. I'm reading the signs on this from two sections in a video by Glenford Mitchell on the YouTube channel Bahai Perspective. Glenford was a member of the Universal House of Justice for 26 years. Before that, he was on the NSA of the United States. He trained and worked in journalism and publishing. He edited the World Order magazine. He's somebody who picks his words carefully. He gave a talk on the Baha'i concept of civilization, which appeared on Bahai Perspective in July 2021. I think the talk has been staged for the video, rather than the video being a recording of a talk. The audience is a small group of young Baha'is who have been prepped with questions to ask. I think it's been scripted to convey a message on behalf of the House of Justice. And it's a good purpose. I agree with his message. I hope many Baha'is will listen to what he says. And I think I understand why the Universal House of Justice would send a message in this indirect way. I recommend watching the talk from the beginning. I will put the link in the description section below this video. Click on More to see all the links. I'm going to give an audio commentary over the talk, which you can follow by reading the subtitles. Glenford's talk gets interesting for me at 14 minutes 30 seconds. He has been talking about Baha'u'llah's message to the rulers, advocating arms limitation, consultation between nations, and a world pact of mutual security to abolish aggression. That's the job of the rulers. And Glenford talks about the job of the Baha'is, which politicians cannot do, to transform people's hearts, to overcome prejudices, to teach people not to follow clergy and politicians and the like, but rather to investigate truth for themselves. Such a transformation, to be effective, must be connected to a belief in the Prophet, who brought this message. So we have two processes. And he says these two processes must eventually merge. And merge is the word that carries the message here. There's a letter on behalf of Shoghi Effendi that says, "The Universal House of Arbitration and the International Tribunal are the same. When the Baha'i state will be established, they will be merged in the Universal House of Justice." That is nonsense. A Baha'i state is a nation. The International Tribunal, as specified by Abdu'l-Bahā and Shoghi Effendi, is an international institution formed by the national governments. How could the formation of a Baha'i state somewhere lead to a merger between the International Tribunal and the International House of Justice? There are more comments to be made about that letter. There's a posting on my Baha'i Studies blog about it. My point here is just that Glenford is referencing this merge letter in his talk and giving it a twist. The idea that the International Tribunal and the International House of Justice were the same thing developed through the first English, French and German translations of Some Answered Questions, which asserted this equation in two footnotes, since removed. In the 1930s, it was still the general idea among Baha'is, so the Secretary's answer is not surprising. I've summarized the secondary Baha'i literature in an article called Theocratic Ideas and Assumptions, which you can download as a PDF. And there's an article on my blog called How Theocracy Happened. I do not know which secretary wrote the merge letter. In June 1933, both Hussein Rabbani and Ruhi Afnan were assisting Shoghi Effendi as secretaries. Hussein Rabbani had theocratic ideas and wrote some articles on church and state opposing the views of Shoghi Effendi. Hussein Rabbani was equally independent in his work as secretary. In one letter in 1934 he writes, "The following is the list of the 5 teachers whom the Master sent to America in order to spread the cause. They were Khairullah, Abdul Karim, Haji Mirza Hassan, Mirza Abul Fadl, and Mirza Asadullah." But he follows up later in another letter saying, "The statement I made on behalf of the Guardian is, due to a misunderstanding on my part, incorrect. Khairullah could not have been one of these teachers." Ruhi Afnan's approach to the role of secretary can be shown by another example from the same year. On March 29, 1933, Ruhi Afnan wrote to Eric Watkin, referring to Watkin's thesis on Bahai teachings and education. The letter says that Shoghi Effendi has not read the thesis, and follows with detailed corrections to it. Logically, these corrections must be primarily from Ruhi Afnan. But he also says, "I have mentioned this to the Guardian, and he also feels you had better leave out the passage." These 2 secretaries seem to act like the committees of an NSA, rather than the personal assistant of a chief executive officer. They are doing work on behalf of the Guardian, rather than writing letters he is too busy to write. I would not classify any of the 3 letters I have mentioned as on behalf of Shoghi Effendi, but somebody has decided they are. There hasn't been much systematic work on the history of the Secretariat in Shoghi Effendi's time, but you can find some on my blog using the search term Antipodes. What emerges there is that editors make most of the decisions, and they tend to preserve everything of historical interest, including material that is not really a secretary writing on behalf of the Guardian. But back to the point. This idea of the International Tribunal merging in the Universal House of Justice is not found anywhere else in the Baha'i literature. A memorandum from the research department says they have not been able to find any statements in the Baha'i writings which explicate how the Supreme Tribunal will merge with the Universal House of Justice. That was written in June 17, 1996. It would be rather odd if a major point was to be enshrined in the Baha'i teachings only through one letter to an individual. In his presentation, Glenford has framed the word merge in the context of 2 processes merging. Glenford is saying, in effect, that the secretary must have meant that the processes would merge, and the relationship between the tribunal and the Universal House of Justice would be modified. My approach to that letter is more direct. The secretary plainly says that the establishment of a Baha'i state will cause the institutions of the International Tribunal to merge in the House of Justice. And that is nonsense. At the time the merged letter was written, Shoghi Effendi's policy was that his secretary's letters to individuals should not be published. He probably had a reason for that. He later decided they could be published, with his specific approval. If Shoghi Effendi had approved publication of this letter, I think the research department would have noted that in their memorandum of June 1996. So the merged letter is just a letter not originally intended for publication, later published without the Guardian's approval. It's part of the history, but is it a letter on behalf of Shoghi Effendi, as we usually understand the term? In this talk, Glenford frames this merging as the merging of 2 processes. There are many references in the Baha'i writings to 2 simultaneous processes that must increasingly intersect. One is the 2 calls tablet of Abdu'l-Bahā in selections from the writings of Abdu'l-Bahā. O ye concourse of the kingdom of Abha, 2 calls to success and prosperity are being raised. The one is the call of civilization, of the progress of the material world. This pertaineth to the world of phenomena, promoteth the principles of material achievement, and is the trainer for the physical accomplishments of mankind. It compriseth the laws, regulations, arts, and sciences through which the world of humanity has developed. The propagator and executive power of this call is just government. The other is the soul-stirring call of God, whose spiritual teachings are safeguards of the everlasting glory, the eternal happiness and illumination of the world of humanity. Abdu'l-Bahā's Resāle-ye Sīyasīyyah is about the same question: how organized religion and organized politics, that is, church and state, should work together for the well-being of all peoples. I've translated Abdu'l-Bahā's book online under the title The Art of Governance, and there's an updated translation in Principles for Progress, along with an annotated edition of the Persian text. In Shoghi Effendi's Citadel of Faith, there's a section headed The Workings of Two Simultaneous Processes. He says, "We cannot fail to perceive the workings of two simultaneous processes, each clearly defined, each distinctly separate, yet destined to culminate in a single glorious consummation." And he says that one of these processes is associated with the mission of the American Baha'i community, the other with the destiny of the American nation. That's church and state. The first process dates from Abdu'l-Bahā's tablets and proceeds through the institutions of the Baha'i administrative order to conduct teaching plans, and will be consummated through the emergence of the Baha'i World Commonwealth in the Golden Age. The other, the political process as it concerns the United States, dates from the First World War that made the United States the biggest player engaged in a world upheaval, leading to President Wilson's 14 points, then the Second World War, Roosevelt's Atlantic Charter, the birth of the United Nations at the San Francisco Conference, and so on. This political process must lead to the emergence of a world government and the establishment of the lesser peace. It must culminate in the unfurling of the banner of the most great peace in the golden age of the dispensation of Baha'u'llah. Just to repeat that, Shoghi Effendi speaks of two processes, each clearly defined, each distinctly separate, yet closely related and destined to culminate in a single glorious consummation. That's also how he saw the institutions of the world government and the Baha'i administrative order. Each is clearly defined, distinctly separate, and they are destined to harmonize their functions for the common aim of human well-being. They are not to merge, they are distinctly separate. In his 1921 presentation on the Baha'i movement at Oxford, he said, "Church and state, thus far from being divorced from one another, are harmonized. Their interests are reconciled, are brought to cooperate for the same end, yet for each is preserved its special and definite sphere of activity." There's more on that Oxford paper on my blog. The link is in the video description. So Glenford Mitchell is on strong grounds in saying that the Baha'i teachings envision two distinct social reform processes, political and religious, which must progressively influence one another. History also shows that. Christianity began as a subversive fringe movement in the Roman Empire, but in the age of Christendom, the monarchies and the church were the two central institutions, and of these the church was the more coherent and sustained over the generations. The church was the supreme institution of the Christian world order, and before the Great Schism, the papacy was undisputed as the supreme organ of the Christian world order. But the papacy was not the government, except in the Papal States. render unto Caesar was an essential part of the medieval Christian world order. That's also how I understand the Baha'i Commonwealth. The religious institutions of the Baha'i community, the houses of worship and the house of justice, the schools and hospitals and charities, might eventually dominate the cityscape, but they can never assume the role of government. Shoghi Effendi writes, "Theirs is not the purpose to allow the machinery of their administration to supersede the government of their respective countries." You might think I've read a great deal into Glenford Mitchell using the word merge. It gets clearer during the question time, at the second question at 20 minutes and 20 seconds, when a boy called Askar asks, "Should the Baha'is achieve their desired future, how will the House of Justice deal with problems such as the financial crisis?" And Glenford says, "The rulers of the world will eventually establish a world government. That government will govern things such as finances and so on. That's their business." And he adds, "The government might want to seek the advice of the Universal House of Justice from the point of view of the teachings of Baha'u'llah. But whether the House of Justice itself would be ruling on financial questions, it's doubtful. I don't know." Askar then adds another question. If there are a majority of Baha'is in the future, will a world government still exist or not? And on that Glenford has no doubt. He replies, "Yes, because Baha'u'llah says there will be a world government, and that's part of the divine process. The fact that there's a Baha'i community doesn't mean necessarily that the Baha'i institutions will be running the community as governments." This is presented as matter of fact, but it's an earthquake. On the one hand, Glenford is doubtful and doesn't know about the future. On the other hand, he says that matters such as finances are the government's business, and when asked whether a world government must exist alongside the House of Justice, he says yes, because it is in the writings. To see why this is an earthquake in the thinking of the Universal House of Justice and the leading cadre of the Baha'i community, I will go back to 1995, when I asked the research department at the Baha'i World Centre for help in locating some quotes, and the Secretariat replied on behalf of the Universal House of Justice, and sent their reply to the councillors and also to the National Spiritual Assemblies of Canada, Germany, and the United States, saying, "It is understood that this issue has been a matter of discussion in your countries." The letter was for use when the question arises, and not intended to be published at that time. But later it was published in Messages of the Universal House of Justice, 1986 to 2001. The letter has been given the title Separation of Church and State, and you can find it easily enough. The 1995 letter fails to mention Baha'u'llah's key texts, such as "Render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar." It takes one letter on behalf of Shoghi Effendi about David Hoffman's term Baha'i theocracy out of context, so that it appears that Shoghi Effendi was talking in those terms, which he was not. I've demonstrated that in an article on my blog called "What About the Baha'i Theocracy?" The letter also relies on a statement from the NSA of the Baha'is of the United States regarding the participation of Baha'is in politics, dated October 1935, which was approved in letters on behalf of the Guardian on November 29 and December 11, 1935. The NSA's statement also says that humanity will emerge from that immature civilization in which church and state are separate and competitive institutions. In some sources, these words are incorrectly attributed to Shoghi Effendi. But were those words included in the version of the statement on religious membership that the Guardian approved? They were not in earlier versions. They were there in later versions. But the version of October 1935 appears to be unpublished. I have not found it, but someone with access to the local archives of an old Baha'i community in the United States might discover it for us. Even if the words separate and competing were in the version Shoghi Effendi saw and approved, they remained the words of the National Spiritual Assembly, not the Guardian's words. To know the Guardian's views, we can turn to his general letters and his 1921 Oxford paper, which I've just quoted. And if we want to know about ending the competition for power between church and state, we have many authoritative words from Baha'u'llah and from Abdu'l-Bahā. Abdu'l-Bahā says, when the government inquires as to the requirements of the law of God, they, the religious leaders, must explain what they have deduced from the commands of God. Apart from this, what awareness do they have of questions of leadership and social development, the administration and control of weighty matters, worldly well-being and happiness, the improvement of procedures and codes of a temporal law, or foreign affairs and domestic policy? In his video, Glenford Mitchell seems to reference this very quote from Abdu'l-Bahā about government asking the religious leaders for advice. The Baha'i World Centre has been working on a translation of that text for a decade or more. The Universal House of Justice's 1995 letter to me says that Shoghi Effendi's reference to a future that is sure to witness the formal and complete separation of church and state, and another that says theirs is not the purpose to allow the machinery of their administration to supersede the government of their respective countries, refer only to Iran at that time, or only mean that the Baha'is would not seize power. The 1995 letter quotes some letters on behalf of Shoghi Effendi that don't mean what the letter's authors suppose. It references bad translations, and generally it muddles the discussion. The issue is perfectly clear if one begins with Baha'u'llah's writings and authentic words of Abdu'l-Bahā and the general letters of Shoghi Effendi. The 1995 letter concludes, the Baha'i administrative order is the nucleus and pattern of the divinely intended future political system of the world. That's a misquote. What Shoghi Effendi actually says is that the administrative order of the faith is the nucleus and pattern of its world order. In Citadel of Faith, page 5. The early Christians, persecuted in the Roman Empire, were the nucleus of what became the two Christendoms of Eastern and Western Europe. But they were not the seeds of a political system for secular government. The world order of Baha'u'llah is civilizational, as Shoghi Effendi describes it. That civilization must embrace political, religious, technical, and scientific aspects, language, and the vital question of agriculture. It must include Baha'i administration and the house of worship. What makes it Baha'u'llah's world order is the ethos that makes these parts into one whole, a global civilization. This 1995 letter substitutes the words political system, where Shoghi Effendi wrote world order. So the Baha'i administrative order and everything else is being conflated with politics. I don't want to be too negative. There were good points and new information in the 1995 letter, which I used although I couldn't quote them, since the letter was not for publication at that time. It does show how far we've come between the 1995 letter on behalf of the Universal House of Justice and Glenford Mitchell's presentation in 2022. When asked whether the state and government would continue to exist in a Baha'i majority situation, Glenford gives a direct yes. And he's clear that governments have one kind of business and the houses of justice serve a different purpose. This is what Shoghi Effendi wrote as a student at Oxford in 1921. In 1999, I published a paper in the Journal of Church and State called A Theology of the State from the Bahai Teachings. It actually appeared in the year 2000. You can download it from the Baha'i Library site. My curiosity about church and state arose partly from the differences in opinion within the Baha'i community, partly because it is the clearest of a number of pairings that fall under the term organic unity, and partly because external critics and the Iranian regime were accusing the Baha'is of wanting to set up a theocracy, of being a danger to the state. So in my journal article, I clarified the metaphysical principles that Abdu'l-Bahā calls the two forces of church and state, and what this implies for the task and ethos of the Baha'i elected institutions. The article was reviewed by the National Spiritual Assembly in the United States, since the Journal of Church and State is published there. Earlier, historical works by Mangal Bayat and Wan Cole had noted that the separation of church and state was a key pillar in Baha'u'llah's teachings, but my article was more extensive and I took a theological approach. My paper was well received. The editor of the journal found the Baha'i teachings surprisingly subtle, and my article has been cited quite often. The German Baha'i community had been engaged with church and state because a mischief maker had been telling churches and government bodies that the Baha'is were going to set up a theocracy and that their values were incompatible with the foundations of the German state. So I sent a copy of my 1999 article to the German NSA, who responded warmly and sent a copy of my article to all of the friends involved in this work. However, when I suggested to the International Teaching Centre that my article could be a resource for counsellors to keep on file in case their communities were accused of theocratic ambitions, the International Teaching Centre responded that my article was poorly researched trash. Okay, I paraphrase a little, but the full text is on the screen for you to read. That's fair enough in a way. I think the 1995 letter on Church and State, written on behalf of the Universal House of Justice, is not useful because the authors do not understand the elements of Baha'i teachings and they ignore the writings of Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Bahā on this topic, including the writings that Shoghi Effendi translated. While they think my article is rubbish because it did not quote some letters on behalf of Shoghi Effendi that the 1995 letter took out of context, and which I was not allowed to quote anyway, because the 1995 letter was not for publication. My journal article referred only to primary texts, because a limit of 10,000 words doesn't allow for details in secondary or tertiary texts. I have written up these letters on behalf of Shoghi Effendi since then, after the UHJ's 1995 letter was released for publication. Look for What About the Baha'i Theocracy on my blog, which contextualizes one of the letters on behalf of the Guardian that were quoted in the 1995 letter on Church and State. I have research on more of the letters that the International Teaching Centre says are fundamental. The short version of this research is the letters on behalf of Shoghi Effendi tell us nothing of substance that is not already found in the writings of Baha'u'llah, Abdu'l-Bahā and the Guardian. And good practice is to interpret the dubious verses in the light of the clear verses, not to ignore the clear verses until all the doubts of the most dubious have been settled. Another waypoint I should mention is an April 7, 1999 letter on behalf of the Universal House of Justice called Issues Relating to the Study of the Baha'i Faith. This letter characterizes research and publication on the Baha'i teachings as a kind of internal opposition to the authority of the House of Justice, under the influence of the reigning doctrines of materialism. This campaign of opposition, as they saw it then, includes the assertion that the modern political concept of the separation of church and state is somehow one that Baha'u'llah intended as a basic principle of the world order he has founded. Baha'u'llah's position, and he is correct, is that the separation of church and state is part of the ancient faith of God. It is not a modern political concept. Baha'u'llah quotes the Gospels and the Quran in support, and Abdu'l-Bahā does the same in his book, The Art of Governance. And Shoghi Effendi translates and quotes Baha'u'llah on this point. So it is not a modern political concept, but it is absolutely clear that Baha'u'llah and Muhammad and Jesus made the separation of church and state a basic principle of any good world order. The language of the International Teaching Centre and other institutions at the World Centre is usually encouraging, or failing that, it is measured. Compared to that norm, the ITC's letter to me and this 1999 letter are vitriolic. One more loving Baha'i greeting like that would give me concussion. Somebody at that time was very, very upset. In 2016, the New Zealand National Spiritual Assembly wrote to me that they were aware of my persistent efforts spanning over 25 years to promote erroneous and misleading perspectives on the Baha'i teachings. That also is not encouraging language. I am not upset. I've quoted the ITC's letter and its reflection in the NSA's letter because it shows why I interpret the staging of Glenford Mitchell's YouTube presentation and the scripted questions that follow as messaging, communicating that the Universal House of Justice and the leading cadre at the Baha'i World Centre have now accepted that church and state are separate in the world order of Baha'u'llah, and for each is reserved its special and definite sphere of activity, to quote Shoghi Effendi at Oxford. My 1999 article in the Journal of Church and State was a condensation of part of my master's thesis, which I was still researching and writing. I wrote the chapter on church and state in the Baha'i Teachings first, and added the section on church and state in the Quran later, in response to the 9/11 attack in New York and the Islamophobic propaganda that followed. I finally graduated in 2005 with a book entitled Church and State, which you can now download as a PDF from my Baha'i Studies blog under the tab Publications, or you can buy the book from Amazon or Kalimat Press. A few weeks after the book appeared, I was removed from the membership rolls of the Baha'i community, following a decision from the Baha'i World Centre. It is quite possible that the decision followed a consultation from the House itself. But in any case, the letter must have been approved by at least 5 UHJ members, because that is how the Secretariat works. So yes, somebody at that time was very, very upset. But still, the Baha'i writings are what they are, and somebody must be willing to put their head up and state the obvious. The separation of church and state is one of the core Baha'i principles. It is there in part 2 of Baha'u'llah's Kitab-i-Arkan, which defines a doctrine of two sovereignties, worldly and spiritual. It is there in the tablets to the kings and rulers. In Baha'u'llah's last major doctrinal work, the Epistle to the Son of the Wolf, he quotes and endorses "Render unto Caesar," and adds, "If that which belonged to Caesar had not come from God, he, Jesus, would have forbidden it." Think about that. Jesus' saying could be seen as recognizing de facto rights because Caesar is on the coin of the realm. But Baha'u'llah says that God gave and gives authority to Caesar, to the worldly rulers. In the same passage, Baha'u'llah cites a Quranic verse which tells us that Baha'u'llah thought that the separation of church and state was a Quranic teaching. Much of my book on church and state, written for a degree in Islamic studies, is devoted to proving that, yes, it is there in the Quran. In numerous places, Baha'u'llah says things such as, "Your Lord hath committed the world and the cities thereof to the care of the kings of the earth, and made them the emblems of his own power, by virtue of the sovereignty he hath chosen to bestow upon them." There's a compilation on church and state in the Baha'i writings on my blog, under the tab Compilations. Abdu'l-Bahā wrote a book called The Art of Governance, which is devoted to the separation of church and state, and he refers to it as a Baha'i principle in some of his talks. And the idea is there in other writings. Look on my blog for an article on the executive and the legislative in the Will and Testament, because these are the terms Abdu'l-Bahā uses for state power and organized religion. Shoghi Effendi advocates the separation and cooperation of church and state from his student days to his last letters. The silly and unscriptural idea that the Baha'i houses of justice are destined to supplant the civil governments can be put away as one of the things of childhood that the Baha'i community has grown out of, along with the idea that the lesser peace or unity of nations was prophesied for the 20th century, and quite a long list of other silly ideas that the Baha'is once taught and now reject. Since my 1999 journal article, a long list of Baha'i authors and speakers in the English-speaking sphere have come to the same conclusion, that the separation of church and state is part of Baha'u'llah's plan for a new world order. Quite a few of these are Persian speakers, who are saying in English what the Persian-speaking Baha'is have always understood. In March 2021, the YouTube channel Bahai Faith Modern Perspectives posted a presentation given by Dr. Beiruz Sabit. This channel, Bahai Faith Modern Perspectives, is not the same as the Bahai Perspective channel that hosted Glenford Mitchell. At 28 minutes, following an introduction to the two goals of cultural and moral transformation and the renewal of the political and economic structures of society, Beiruz says, and his slide presentation shows, Baha'is believe in separation of church and state, non-involvement in partisan politics. In the question time, at 53 minutes, he is asked, would the separation of church and state mean that the Baha'i institutions, like the local and universal houses of justice, remain as internal institutions of the faith, and not for ruling over general society? While saying that he has no specific answer, Dr. Sabit replies,
separation of church and state is one of the fundamentals of the Baha'i faith. And of course, in the Baha'i faith, we don't have a clergy, and therefore the role of clergy in political activities are automatically removed. We also believe in consultative processes and universal participation of all peoples of the world, whether Baha'i or not, in decision-making, in informing their government, informing their institutions.
In 2008, Roshan Danesh wrote in the Journal of Law and Religion that there are no explicit statements in Baha'i scriptures about the universal house of justice and civil institutions, which necessitate a fully integrationist conclusion. In other words, the idea of a Baha'i theocracy has no scriptural foundation. You can download his paper from the Baha'i Library site. In 2010, in his Hegemony and Revelation article in Religious Studies and Theology, he rejects any claim that the intention of Baha'u'llah's New World Order is for Baha'i political institutions and the Baha'i community to claim and acquire temporal power, and he attributes such views in the past to popular Baha'i discourse. Also in 2009, Farah Dustar, in Beitrage des Erfan Kolloquiums, says that the idea of Baha'i Offenbarung aus Theokratie is based on eine Missverstandenis, misunderstandings, which is precisely correct. The idea, she says, is expressly repudiated in the writings of Baha'u'llah, Abdu'l-Bahā, and Shoghi Effendi, and she cites chapter and verse to prove it. The German-speaking Baha'i communities have been ahead of the English-speaking and French-speaking communities on the topic of church and state. In 2012, Sarus Shahidinejad wrote in the Zeitschrift für Baha'i Studien that Abdu'l-Bahā endorsed der Trennung zwischen der Religion und dem Staat, the separation of church and state. Nada Sayedi expands on the importance of the separation of church and state as one of the essential teachings of the Baha'i faith in a series of talks entitled Text and Context in the Baha'i Heroic Age, held in 2014 at the Santa Monica Baha'i Center in the United States. Listen especially to Talk 6, including the questions and answers. Skipping to 2020, Nada writes on Baha'i Teachings, from Baha'u'llah's point of view, the precondition of the realization of political democracy and social prosperity requires the institutional separation of church and state. For those who undertake a serious study of the Baha'i scriptures, the evidence that Baha'u'llah, Abdu'l-Bahā, and Shoghi Effendi taught and fought for the separation of church and state is beyond any question. They applied it to their own followers, to the trustees of God in the Kitabi Ard, to the House of Justice and tablets of Abdu'l-Bahā, to the House of Justice again in the Will and Testament, to the machinery of Baha'i administration in Shoghi Effendi's World Order of Baha'u'llah, page 66. The evidence is so evident, and the lack of any competing paradigm embracing a wide range of evidence is so obvious that the Mangal Bayat, Wan Cole, Sen McGlynn thesis can be described as a dominant paradigm for now. If Glenford Mitchell is signalling a change in thinking at the Baha'i World Centre, we have come a long way since 2005, when my book Church and State led to me being pilloried as an enemy of the faith, or selective, or pushing an agenda and the like. It's getting better when these aspects of the Baha'i teachings can be carried on mainstream channels such as Baha'i Faith Modern Perspectives and Bahai Perspective. The turnaround is actually the return to an old position. In 1988, a letter on behalf of the Universal House of Justice referenced an earlier House of Justice decision, which I have not seen, describing cases in which the number of believers had increased to the point where the population of some villages had reached 100% or almost 100% Baha'i. There, the House of Justice stated that in each village, while they should elect the local spiritual assembly, they should continue to elect the local council, as required by the government, and the function of these two bodies should be kept distinct, even if their memberships were identical. But if the Universal House of Justice and the councillors at the International Teaching Centre and the editors of Baha'i World and all the other leaders of thought today have a consensus that the separation of church and state is indeed a Baha'i teaching, why not just announce it? Would they signal it by encouraging influential Baha'is such as Glenford Mitchell to include this principle in their presentations and publications. The problem for the Universal House of Justice is that it is barred by the Covenant from providing authoritative interpretations of the Bahai teachings. If they seem to be standing in the shoes of the guardian, their own legitimacy would come in question. But they have leadership, gravitas, respect from the Bahai community. Leaders of thought in the Bahai community will not contradict them. If the House of Justice wants to tell the Bahai community that the separation of church and state is now okay, without saying that they are reversing course, they have to tell the educated English-speaking Baha'is, those who know that my thesis is now widely accepted, that they can talk about the topic without upsetting the Universal House of Justice or the International Teaching Centre. I think Glenford's talk is that signal for those who are alert. Perhaps it is not the first signal. Signalling is not the best way to lead, in my opinion. It supposes a group of Haifa watchers who can pick up the signal and convey it to the community. I like straight talk. A better way, and the method the Universal House of Justice usually uses to elucidate a new issue, or one that is causing differences, is to quote a selection of the writings. The Universal House of Justice could ask the Research Department to make a compilation on church and state, focusing on Shoghi Effendi's selections on this topic in Gleanings. In fact, they could go through my book on church and state and pull out the scriptural quotations there, maybe including the biblical and Quranic quotes, and they would have the backbone of an elucidation showing that the separation of church and state has always been a key teaching of the ancient faith of God, although sometimes obscured by circumstances, corruptions, and misunderstandings. Another step the Universal House of Justice could take would be to publish an English translation of Abdu'l-Bahā's Resāle-ye Sīyasīyyah, The Art of Governance. This book is already available in French, German, and Spanish, and my provisional English translation is available online. A Bahai World Centre edition would be a recognition that the separation of church and state is a central Bahai principle and can be included in our teaching work in English, as it already is in Persian. This principle is included in some of Abdu'l-Bahā's talk on the Bahai principles, in the Persian transcripts, but these are only available to the English-speaking Baha'is in my provisional translation. An authorized English translation of these talks from the Bahai World Centre would be an excellent idea. Some of you must be wondering whether a new stance on church and state might also be signalled by re-enrolling me in the Bahai community. I am quite relaxed about that. I use the analogy of someone who joins a religious order, expecting to be in the abbey for life. But one day the abbot says, "Brother Sen, you are needed in the chapel outside the walls. Pack your bag." In point of fact, I have not moved very far. I am still active as a Bahai with online teaching work and the defense of the faith by translating the Bahai writings and researching questions that trouble Baha'is and putting answers on my blog when I can find answers. But it's quite awkward for the local Baha'is where I lived to have one couple in the district who are known as Baha'is, but the other Baha'is act as if they do not know them. And it would be nice in other ways to be enrolled. Recently I proposed a video presentation for the Corrine True Centre on the subject of Udo Schaefer's thesis on limited infallibility. I disagree with Udo, in part because he assumes definitions of legislation and infallibility that don't correspond to the Persian and Arabic sources. The response to my proposal came from Robert Stockman on June 18, 2024. Dear Sen, thank you for your submission. But since we are an agency of a Baha'i institution, we can't accept your proposal at this time. So I am blacklisted, and the participants are denied the chance to hear my critiques of Udo's conclusions, and I do not get to hear their critiques of my conclusions. Every Baha'i knows, or should know, that the Universal House of Justice does not have supernatural guidance to understand or interpret the Bahai teachings, and the Universal House of Justice does not claim that guidance. Every Baha'i knows, or should know, that the Universal House of Justice can grow in understanding and wisdom. It is learning. From that it follows that the Baha'i community needs a way of cancelling old guidance from the Universal House of Justice. If there's no formal way of saying that a letter such as the 1995 letter has been superseded, the old guidance will muddle the discussion of the subject within the Baha'i community for centuries to come. I think the Universal House of Justice should periodically revise a canon of letters and memoranda from the Baha'i World Centre that continue to be applicable, stating that those letters and publications that are not included in the canon should be regarded as no longer adequate for the Baha'i community today. Well, that's it for me. With those thoughts in mind, watch all of Glenford's video and see what you think.